Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah, we just need to bring it closer. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm Doug Kaiser, and I will be our moderator for today's session. To open our conversation today, I'd like to start with an invitation. To be specific, I'd like to invoke the poem bearing that title by Mary Oliver. In that work, Oliver encourages us to linger for just a little while out of our busy and very important days, to notice the goldfinches that have gathered in a field of thistles. If we pay careful enough attention to these fellow creatures, we will hear them striving melodiously, not for the sake of winning, but for sheer delight and gratitude. And if we listen closely to their expressions of mirth, we will recognize a message of utmost seriousness within their musical play. The message is this: believe us, they say, it is a serious thing just to be alive on this fresh morning in this broken world. We gather here today to discuss this very seriousness, what it means to be alive, what we can learn from other living beings, and what we owe to the life that surrounds us in our own broken yet extraordinary world. Our current moment is one of profound transition. We find ourselves at a threshold where our theological traditions, our ethical and legal frameworks, and our scientific capabilities are all colliding. We have never been merely observers of nature, but today we are, more than ever, its editors, its architects, and all too often, its destroyers. Our panel today brings together four distinct voices to explore the boundaries of this invitation to be alive and to be attuned to life. We will move from the ancient great wheel of virtue that links us to all creatures to the cutting-edge labs where the lines between species are being rewritten. We will ask how our norms and commitments might better recognize our shared vulnerabilities and how our social structures might better reflect the interdependence of all living things. Ultimately, we are here to ask, in a world that feels increasingly broken, how do we craft an ethics that is as wide, as inclusive, as responsible, and yes, as mirthful as the life Mary Oliver so beautifully describes? Doing so is vital. In her words, it could mean something, it could mean everything. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I have a few announcements to share. First, please do note this entire event is being recorded. We will only post the presentation portion of the event on our YouTube channel, not the question and answer period. Second, as just noted, there will be time for audience Q&A following the panel, so please hold your questions until that time. Third, I would like to personally thank Naomi Jennings and Viveka Morris from the Law, Environment, and Animals program who worked so hard to pull this event together. And finally, we'd like to express our great appreciation to the supporters and co-sponsors of this event, including Gary and Veronica Silberberg, Plant Forward Yaleys, the Yale Animal Law Society, Yale Environmental Humanities, the Yale Environmental Law Association, the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, and the Yale Sustainable Food Program. Now, I have taught at a number of different universities around the world, and one thing I think Yale should be rightly proud of is the level of interdisciplinary engagement and collaboration that we undertake. And on that note, I want to turn the floor over briefly to my colleague and dear friend, Mary Evelyn Tucker, who, along with John Grimm, is one of the critical nodes of interconnectivity on our campus. The Forum on Religion and Ecology, which they jointly direct, is of obvious relevance to and resonance with the themes of our panel today. The Forum also has a couple of important announcements to share that we thought would be of interest to this audience. So, Mary Evelyn.
Thank you, Doug. And what an honor to be here to celebrate Jennifer's book with colleagues known and still to be known. We just wanted to share for a few moments a conference in October that might be of interest to those in the audience and to your friends. There's no cost. We'll start there. But we've launched a website called the Living Earth Community.com, actually, But in the fall, October 17th, at the Peabody Museum here at Yale, we're having an interdisciplinary conference of people from science, nature writing, some Yale faculty, a lot from outside of Yale, that will highlight some of the themes perhaps that will come up right now. But beginning with Jane Lubchenco, who will do the nature record, which is a whole effort at biodiversity reporting in this country. And that's a story in itself. But just briefly, this will go from cells and plants and fungi, trees, up through the fish, mammalian world, and speak about what are the intelligences of nature that are emerging all over, not just in the US, but in many, many places. Intelligences of nature, the ecological worldviews resulting from that, and Earth law, especially rights of nature, and so on. So we invite you to come to participate. Maybe some smaller discussions will arrive at the same time with people who might come back. But we thank you so much for considering this in the fall, October 17th, the Peabody Museum. Thank you.
Okay, now let me introduce our very distinguished group of speakers. I'll introduce them in the order that we'll hear from them. Jennifer Herdt is the Gilbert L. Professor of Christian Ethics at Yale Divinity School, where she also serves as Senior Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs. She's past president of the Society of Christian Ethics and is widely celebrated for her work on virtue ethics, early modern and modern moral thought, and political theology. The book we're celebrating today, The Great Wheel of Being, Ethics Beyond the Human, will be released by Yale University Press later this year. It challenges the traditional great chain of being that imagines humanity sitting atop a ladder of natural existence. Instead, Professor Herdt draws on ancient theological and philosophical imagery to propose instead a great wheel of being where humans, non-human animals, and the environment exist in a non-hierarchical, radiant relationship to the source of life. The other book that we're celebrating today is an in-progress work by Professor Carter Snead, the Charles E. Rice Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame, where he previously served as director of the De Nicholas Center for Ethics and Culture. A world-renowned expert in bioethics, Professor Snead has dedicated his career to exploring the intersections of law, ethics, and the biological sciences, having served as a member of UNESCO's International Bioethics Committee and as general counsel to the President's Council on Bioethics. Professor Snead's most recent work, which serves as the foundation for today's talk, is entitled Ethics at the Edges of Humanity, a title so good we plagiarized it for the title of our event today. In this project, Professor Snead tackles the ontological boundary crossing made possible by revolutionary innovations in bioengineering. In addition to our two authors, we're fortunate to have two remarkable commentators. Sheila Jasanoff is the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she's the founder and director of the program on science, technology, and society. A pioneer in her field, she has spent decades investigating how science and technology both shape and are shaped by law and politics. Among numerous other awards and distinctions, Professor Jasanoff is a recipient of the Holberg Prize, which is often described as the Nobel Prize for the disciplines it honors. Her work is essential for today's conversation because it helps situate our theological and legal questions within the broader complex machinery of global power and social values. Through numerous landmark works over her career, she has explored how societies write the rules for life itself. Her scholarship has consistently asked who gets to speak for the natural world and whose knowledge becomes authoritative when we make decisions about the environment. Our other commentator is Willis Jenkins, the John Allen Hollingsworth Professor of Ethics in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. Professor Jenkins is a co-director of the Coastal Futures Conservatory, an extraordinary project that integrates arts, sciences, and humanities to listen to environmental change. A preeminent voice in environmental humanities, Professor Jenkins' work explores how global ecological changes, from climate change to mass extinction, challenge our traditional concepts of moral agency and responsibility. He's a prolific author and the recipient of the American Academy of Religion's Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion. I could go on, but you want to hear from them, not from me. So as I invite Professor Herdt up to the lectern, please join me in offering a warm round of applause and welcome to all of our speakers.
Thank you so much, Doug, for creating this event, making it possible, and drawing together such a dream team of panelists to engage this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thank you all for being here on a day when you'd much rather be outside somewhere enjoying the breezes. I'm also grateful for that poem from Mary Oliver. We should have had this conversation a long time ago because I could have just used that to launch my book. It's appropriate in a number of ways, which maybe will become evident as I talk a little bit about. So I want to essentially to just take my time today in my opening comments to tell you about the book. Essentially, I'll tell you about the title of the book, but I'll start with the subtitle. And then I look forward to our panel discussion and to engaging also intersections with Carter Snead's project. Can you all hear me okay? I wasn't sure if the mic was doing its thing. No. Okay. I don't know if there's a way to get a volume. Here it goes.
It's all the way up.
All right, it's not as it goes. I don't know if it helps to be at the same level. All right, I'll do my best to get it into the mic. Okay, so I'm going to start with the subtitle. The book is The Great Wheel of Being, Ethics Beyond the Human. So ethics beyond the human, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm interested in unpacking and defending a pretty expansive account of the ethical as practical responsiveness to the good. Practical responsiveness to the good, whereby the good, I mean anything that is appropriately valued. So a very pluralistic conception of the good. And if we understand the ethical in this way, then the ethical expands to include all life forms. All life forms are sensitive to and responsive to distinctive constellations of goods. I actually spend most of the book, however, focused on a fairly narrow band of non-human animals, especially mammals and birds, especially highly social mammals. And I'll come back to that. But I want to just begin with that notion of the ethical as practical responsiveness to the good. And I want also to be attentive to ethics in its, what I call its explicit form. In its explicit form, ethics involves awareness of multiple perspectives. It involves awareness of competing goods. It involves exchanging reasons. It involves asking for justifications. It involves a pursuit of what I would call all things considered reasons. If we understand the ethical in this explicit sense, it's confined, I think, to language-using animals. And we are the only language-using animals. There are many, many animals that communicate, but as I define language, humans are the only language-using animals of which we're aware. I situate this project at the intersection of two crises, a crisis of humanity and a crisis of morality, or of the moral. So what's the crisis of the human, or the crisis of humanity? This concept of the human that we tend to associate with universal human dignity, universal rights, has turned out to be tainted. It's turned out to be a concept that has been used, on the one hand, to situate the human over against the animal, where the human is at the top of the hierarchy. But it's also a concept that we are increasingly aware of, has been used to distinguish the fully, ideally human from the subhuman, the infrahuman, the never quite fully human, the permanently immature, the defective. And so there's a crisis around the use of this concept. And there are post-humanist and anti-humanist thinkers who advocate essentially throwing it out the window, doing without a concept of the human because of its taint. I engage with some of these thinkers, and I find very important insights in them. Ultimately, I think we're not going to be able to do without a concept of humanity. But I do think that we need to remind ourselves in very deep ways of human animality. So we need to remind ourselves that we are human animals, and that we can't therefore get along with an understanding of the human as over against the animal. And that's part and parcel of a broader project of correcting human exceptionalism. So this is ultimately a project of philosophical anthropology, also of theological anthropology, since I think as a theologian. So I'm reflecting on the human, and I'm reflecting on the human through the lens of human animality. And I'm focused in particular on aspects of our moral agency, of our practical responsiveness to the good, and the ways in which we see dimensions of moral agency in other animals. So very briefly, that's the crisis of humanity. The crisis of morality, on the other hand, takes multiple forms. One of these is a Foucauldian suspicion that moral distinctions are merely an oppressive tool of the powers that be. Again, very important insights in this critique. But taken too far, this undermines the liberatory movements that were intended to be funded by the critique. It becomes critique as an end in itself. That's only one dimension of the crisis of morality. There's another crisis that flows from science and from an enthusiastic rush on the part of scientists at the moment to explain morality, explain the origins, the evolutionary origins of morality in particular. And we've seen some very interesting shifts since 1976, when Richard Dawkins gave us the story of the selfish gene, which was very, very influential. There have been major shifts in biology, and that is no longer a persuasive story. And instead, the game is about cooperation. And most of these stories are stories about the evolution of evolutionarily stable solutions that sustain cooperation. So morality is seen essentially now as a strategy for cooperation. One of the issues with this is it flows from basically the scientistic character of our society, the excessive authority that is given to science. So we tend to forget that science can only give us answers to certain kinds of questions, that science tends to narrow our perspective. So these stories about the evolution of morality, well, there's a lot of problems with them, some of which have to do with the fact that they are very, very strong interpretations, we could say, of the empirical evidence. But also, there's a basic issue, which is that they stand at a remove from the engaged stance of practical rationality. They can never tell us about they can tell us about how some strategy evolved. They can tell us what humans took to be right and good, but they can't answer the question of what is, in fact, right and good. They give us descriptive accounts of objectivity and morality, but they don't succeed in bringing us all the way into the ineliminably normative tasks of practical reason. There's also the problem that I think morality is too narrow a category. Morality is understood as tool for cooperation, moves the conversation beyond explicit codes of behavior, say, or beyond a notion of morality that's just pure altruism, but it leaves out a lot. It leaves out a lot of what I'm trying to draw attention to, forms of responsiveness to value that don't overtly serve the ends of social coordination. As part of a shift that took place also within modern moral philosophy, there's a whole realm of the sphere of practical reason that is now regarded as non-moral, that's regarded as an arena of personal choice. All things considered practical reason was reduced to prudence, regarded as care for the agent's own interests, and not properly part of morality. The ethical, in contrast, this broad sphere of the ethical that I'm drawing attention to, is not merely or solely human. As a reference point, I find it helpful to recall the philosopher Christine Korsgaard, who spoke of a revolution in ethics. A revolution from a time when it was held that value is more real than experienced fact, to a modern understanding that the world is just matter, the world is just stuff, and that it's humans who impose value on the world, who impose the good on the world. And at a very basic level, it's that with which I'm fundamentally disagreeing in this project. So the world, as I understand it, is oriented to responsiveness to the good. It's oriented ultimately to reflective awareness of the good. It's because creatures evolved that were sensitive to the goods that enabled their survival and reproduction that it was possible for creatures to evolve that were sensitive to the good as such. That were sensitive to goods that compete with and frustrate one another and could wrestle with the complexity of that. How do I proceed in developing this ethics beyond the human? By way of pretty fine-grained engagements with a lot of empirical science. So I engage with comparative psychology, ethology, animal cognition, evolutionary anthropology, and a lot more. And I have, through various chapters, I engage with how other animals exhibit empathy, how they build intimate social attachments, how they cooperate, how they reconcile following conflicts or disputes, how they mourn the death of loved ones, respond negatively to inequities, observe implicit social norms, express reactive social emotions like anger, which are linked in humans to responsibility practices, and play. And I'll come back to play. Here's a famous anecdote that you might have heard of. It's from Frans de Waal. Frans de Waal has a host of wonderful anecdotes about animals. This is one about Cooney the bonobo. Cooney the bonobo came across a stunned bird one day in her enclosure. The bird had flown against a glass wall and was stunned, lying on the ground. Cooney picked her up, found the tallest tree in the enclosure, climbed to the top of the tree, and carefully spread the wings of the bird out and held it in the air. The bird did not fly away. Cooney then took the bird back down and stayed with it for several hours until it finally did regain consciousness and flew away. What are we to make of a story like this? What thoughts or feelings are we to ascribe to Cooney? Can we say that Cooney felt sorry for the bird? Can we say that Cooney made the judgment that the bird belonged in the sky? Did Cooney understand that the bird was vulnerable, that the bird was subject to harm, that the bird needed care and protection? All right, I'll confess. I worry that we tend to anthropomorphize extravagantly when we're confronted with stories like these. But these are marvelous stories. I think they do reveal a lot, and I think we need to be very careful in drawing conclusions from them. Cooney has, I think, a very rich emotional life, and it's an emotional life that has a lot of kinship with our own. But Cooney does not participate in the world of language, of reason-giving, of judgment. So part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to explore that complexity and to think about what kinds of judgments we can make about stories like this. I'm certainly not here to glorify natural goodness. That's not what I mean when I affirm ethics beyond the human. There's plenty of natural goodness. There's also lots of natural nastiness, right? Other animals hunt and devour one another. They compete with one another for food and mates. They dominate one another. So I try to be honest about all of that. It's not about some sort of greenwashing. It's also not a work of animal ethics. It's not about how we ought to treat other animals. It's not about whether they have moral standing, whether they have rights. It's not about whether there are justifications for practices like eating other animals or trapping them or whatever it might be. Those are all very important questions. I think they lie downstream of my project. So I had enough on my hands with this project without going there. The cognitive and affective powers of various animals give them capacities to perceive and respond to distinctive clusters of goods. They experience and respond to them as mattering. So the world isn't just experienced as mere stuff. It's experienced as a site of value. It's experienced as significant and having valence. And I think importantly, we need to get beyond the thought that somehow other animals are selfish and we are moral, that other animals are purely going after their self-interest. Living things are sensitive to a host of goods. Some subset of those living things have feelings about those goods, are conscious of those goods, and feel the ways in which they matter. And then subset again can feel and think about this mattering and reflect on how things matter for self and other. And we're in that subset. These are scaffolded capacities. So to be a self-conscious living creature is, I think, very importantly, an intensification of, rather than a departure from, the forms of sensitivity and awareness that we find in other forms of animals and other organisms. All right, so that's a bit of a sense of what's going on in the subtitle of the book. What about the title? The Great Wheel of Being. This is a core image that I take from the late 4th, early 5th century Christian Platonist theologian Pseudo-Dionysius. And it's picked up and it's developed more by the 7th century theologian Maximus the Confessor. This image imagines the divine logos, the divine word, reason, the intelligible structure of the cosmos as the center of a wheel. And from this wheel go forth innumerable spokes. The innumerable spokes are thought of as logoi. So we have the logos and the logoi. And the particular logoi, these spokes of the wheel, intelligibly structure particular creatures and their myriad ways of being. And the point of this image is to say that the logoi are directly anchored in the logos, that they're directly anchored in this divine reason. And it's a way of affirming, therefore, that each creature has an immediate relationship to the logos. It's a way of pushing back against what is so often associated with Christian Platonism, which is the great chain of being. The great chain of being, according to which there's this hierarchy, and creatures near the bottom of the hierarchy relate to the logos, to divine being, reason, only in a mediated way. I find it a powerful image. Don't we still talk about higher and lower organisms? Don't biologists still talk about higher and lower organisms? Yes. And I think we need to, well, we don't need to talk about higher and lower animals, but we do need to recognize organizational hierarchies. But we need to distinguish organizational hierarchies from value hierarchies. Complex organisms are higher, let's say, because their possibility is predicated on the prior existence of simpler organisms. That's organizational hierarchy. So to give an example of that, before there were eukaryotic cells with nuclei, there were prokaryotic cells without nuclei. You couldn't get a eukaryotic cell until you could until a cell could engulf another cell, right? So organizationally, prokaryotic cells are lower on the organizational hierarchy than eukaryotic cells. Similarly, multicellular organisms are lower on the organizational hierarchy than multicellular, more complex, unicellular, less complex. You need the unicellular before you can get the multicellular. It's pretty obvious when you unpack it that way. In that sense, yes to organizational hierarchy, but we have these tendencies to map that onto value or hierarchy, to think more complex is more valuable. That's the step that I think this image of the great wheel of being helps us to undo. One theological way of thinking about this looks to early theologians who affirmed God's absolute simplicity. If God is absolutely simple, you undo the tendency to think that greater complexity automatically means being closer to God, being more like God. I do want to affirm that organizational hierarchy matters ethically. Increasing complexity means that there are more dimensions along which organisms can flourish or fail to flourish or be harmed. So organizational complexity means more dimensions that need to be taken into account if you are thinking about how to appropriately treat other creatures. But I think basically we obscure rather than illuminating that complexity when we simply take an organizational hierarchy and we map it onto a value hierarchy. There's another theological resource for this project that I want to briefly talk about, which is Theoria Physicae. Because I understand this book as, despite all of its very detailed, nitty-gritty engagement with lots of empirical science, as a recovery and a reinvention of an ancient monastic practice. And it's the practice of natural contemplation, the practice of Theoria Physicae. It's a kind of reading of the book of nature as revelatory of divine logos, of divine reason, as a reading of nature as a site for some kind of divine self-communication. It was first developed by the 4th century Greek Christian monastic Evagrius. And he situates Theoria Physicae, but within the monastic life, between ascetic discipline, praktike, and theology. And I think this is quite telling. So we're talking about stages in the monastic life, and all of these are part of a practice of political asceticism. These were monks who went out into the desert as a refusal of participation in the life of imperial Rome. They understood themselves to be remaking relationships. They were refusing slavery, they were refusing participation in extractive wealth, and they were working to reorder relations. So natural contemplation, they understood as part of this practice of political asceticism. I think that's helpful for us to think about how transformative can our forms of natural contemplation be. What did Theoria Physicae consist in? Contemplating the logos and the logoi, right? Thinking about this great wheel of being. Seeking to trace relationships within nature, to understand the cosmos as an ordered, intelligible whole. They tended to think about it in terms of contemplatively ascending and descending Porphyrian trees, if that is at all familiar to you. That was a way of organizing the natural world according to species and genus relationships. And that's not what I'm doing, but I'm trying to reimagine what this practice can be for us in our context. And Evagrius and Maximus, who takes over this notion, is concerned about natural contemplation as a healing practice. It's healing what they called the gnomic will of the human. So they were very aware of the fact that humans have a freedom to mess up the relationships of the natural world. And they're understanding this participation in natural contemplation as a healing thing. So I understand this Theoria Physicae as a contemplative practice, but also as a kind of play. And one of the sites of the ethical beyond the human that most captivates me in this project is play. So lots of animals play. Not all animals play. In order to play, we think they need something that Gordon Burghardt, who's foremost theorist, student of play, calls a relaxed field. You need a relaxed field free from immediate survival pressures. Those are the conditions within which animals are able to play. And there are different forms of play. There's object play, well, locomotor play, let's start with that. Locomotor play, object play, and social play. Locomotor play, think of the young foal that is just kind of galloping across the pasture, just discovering for the first time. What does it feel like to move one's limbs? What does it feel like to have the wind kind of rushing past you? That's locomotor play. What can your body do in the world? Object play, my favorite example is dolphins playing with air bubbles. Apparently dolphins like to make bubbles and then play around with them in the water. But we see lots of examples of object play. Zoo animals will play with balls that you have in their enclosures and so on. And then social play, which we see in especially a lot of social carnivores, wrestling, play fighting, play mating. There are different kinds of things here. And social play certainly is a crucial site for learning. It's interesting ethically because it's for social animals. In social play, it's a site for learning about fairness. So you have to have fair play, or else you're not going to find a play partner anymore. If you bite your partner too hard, then they're not going to play with you anymore. And so this is how social animals learn something like fairness. But beyond that, very importantly for my project, all play is autotelic. Play is engaged in as worthwhile in itself, as rewarding in itself. The individual animal is obviously not thinking, oh, I better learn about fairness, let me play. The individual animal is just playing because it's fun. So play is, let's say, beyond the seriousness of ethics, but I see it as this very much a key site of attentive appreciativeness to self, other, self-world, and other. So for me, it is actually a key site for the ethical, understood in this very broad, expansive way that I'm defending here. And therefore, attending to play is a key way in which we can work to dismantle human exceptionalism and more fully inhabit human animality. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Herdt. And now we will hear from Professor Snead.
Thank you so much, Doug, and to the Law, Environment, and Animal Program, and to Willis and Sheila and Jennifer for a wonderful presentation just now.
It's a tribute to the organizers of this program how deeply connected our projects
are to one another, even though they have very different points of departure. Just a few words on the origin story of my project. My previous book, which had an even more self-aggrandizing title, which was What It Means to Be Human. I was asked if I would consider, by the publisher, to consider writing a sequel to it. And
started thinking about what kinds of questions
emerged. In the first book, I made the case for the proposition that the richest understanding of human identity and flourishing has to take into account our embodied nature. And thinking critically and carefully about our embodied nature leads us to certain kinds of attitudes about how we stand in relationship to one another and what we owe to one another. And drawing upon the work of Alistair McIntyre and Michael Sandel, came up with a framework for human flourishing that wasn't
so much about the autonomous will as it was about interlocking webs of mutually independent, reciprocally indebted people whose
highest flourishing was to care for one another. So after thinking about what it means to be human, I wanted to ask some questions and think about the boundaries of humanity. Not what it means to be human, but who counts as human, and who does the counting, and what are the consequences? And then equally importantly, especially to this gathering, what are the additional questions once you've settled the boundaries issue? What other obligations do we have, and how do we stand in relationship to those beings that fall outside the boundaries of humanity? Because it doesn't, in my view, exhaust our ethical obligations once we've decided that this or that is not a member of the human family, but rather some other kind of living organism. That we still have to think carefully about how we stand in relationship to that being, and what our obligations are, our obligations, as well as those we willfully assume. And so the question of boundaries has come under enormous pressure recently. I mean,
dealing with natural kinds is hard enough, but when you get into the realm of bioengineering, you start thinking about questions involving
novel beings that we bioengineer for our purposes, in some cases for our extractive purposes, unprecedented beings that don't have any kind of framework within which to situate them in a taxonomy, or we know what we make them out of, but we don't exactly know what they are, and we have a hard time understanding what their structure and function is and what it means for their identity. And in particular, there are three cases that I take up in the book of bioengineering that put enormous pressure on the boundaries question. The first is the creation of stem cell-based embryo models, sometimes called synthetic embryos. There are different kinds, or different approaches, or different iterations of this. The question is, what is the living being that we've created using pluripotent cells? It looks and behaves and recapitulates the processes of embryonic human development. The next case, and that's in some ways a question about what an organism is and what parts, it's sort of a metaphysical question about parts and wholes. The second case is a case of combining human and non-human. And I take up the question of animal-human chimeras, especially neural chimeras, that are non-human animals whose brains are composed of human cells. How do you think about what this being is? And that's a question about the markers of humanity and our obligations to the natural world of time. The third case that I take up is in some ways the most complicated. It's the question of neural organisms, sometimes controversially referred to, provocatively referred to as mini brains. So they're structurally and functionally living three-dimensional brain models of different levels of complexity. And the question is, well, okay, so we can think about what it means to have kidney tissue in a dish or even beating heart in a dish. What does it mean to have something like a living brain in a dish, given that we associate structure and function of brain so intimately with the markers of humanity, distinctive characteristics of these beings? So the third case, in some way, combines the first question of parts and wholes with the second question, which is the question of the markers of marriage. And I've been unsatisfied by the standard moves in bioethics to draw boundaries of humanity, theories of personhood, and so on. And I thought that those questions were, those frameworks were too thin. I thought they didn't really produce robust enough guidance and wisdom, especially moving from questions of ethical inquiry to questions of public policy and law. We have to deliberate and govern ourselves on these complicated questions. And so I thought I would take a step back and ask questions about the first order principles that are operative when you're trying to figure out what something is and how you stand in relationship to it. And taking the examples that I sketched out, I focus on the question of life, the definition of life, the definition of organism, and what are the distinctive and unique markers of humanity. Now, if I took those questions in the abstract, I would never be done with this project. Those are the most perennial and deep and vexed questions that we have. So instead of doing that, I decided to focus on a particular 20th century thinker who I think is very well known in Europe, much less well known than he should be in the United States, who focused his work and life on questions, philosophy of biology, and ethics of technology, and environmentalism, who brings to the table a unique perspective. His biography is unique and compelling, and he proposes answers to those questions that I've raised about what is an organism, what is life, what are the markers of humanity, and how do human beings stand in relation to the rest of the biosphere? How do they stand in relation to the other world of living nature in which we find ourselves? And the thinker that I'm talking about is Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas was a student of Martin Heidegger, who was a classmate of Hannah Arendt. He originally began his work in theology under the supervision of Rudolf Bultmann, focusing on the question of Gnosticism. Very much a field from the questions where he ended up in his life. But his life changed dramatically when his mentor, Martin Heidegger, became a Nazi. Hans Jonas was Jewish, as was his classmate Hannah Arendt, as were several other classmates. And he was shocked and scandalized when his mentor, whom he took to be the greatest philosopher living at the time, to become a Nazi. He had to ask himself, what happened? First he fled. First he fled to London to finish his work on Gnosticism. And then he changed his mind about the entire direction of his career because he wanted to find what happened in the thinking of his mentor about the nature of being itself that led him in a nihilistic direction to embrace Nazi ideology and to betray everything he seemed to stand for. And Jonas wasn't convinced merely that Heidegger was a person of low character. He didn't think he was just a weak and dishonorable person, although those things I think are probably true. He thought the reason that Heidegger made the mistake that he did was precisely because he was thinking about being in the wrong way. So he decided to finish his work on Gnosticism and shift to philosophy of biology to, in his words, save being from Heidegger. He wanted to dedicate himself to thinking about where his mentor went wrong. He drew initially upon his own work studying and critiquing the Gnostics, and he believed that he found the same kinds of errors in thinking about being and nature in Heidegger that were present in the Gnostics that he studied first in his studies as a graduate student. He thought that he identified in Heidegger the same kind of radical dualism and opposition between humankind and nature itself, both in the Gnostics and in Heidegger. He thought that this disunity stripped nature of all of its normative meaning. It cast the human as an alien in a world that's completely hostile and meaningless, and stripped nature itself of all of its intrinsic value and all of its normativity. And he thought this was a terrible mistake. Jonas thought this was a mistake with the Gnostics. He thought it was a mistake with respect to Heidegger and the existentialists that followed him later on. And so he decided to focus his inquiry on the question of the living body. He believed that the living body was the source of wisdom for the question of being itself. And in the living body, he could by conducting what he refers to as an existential reinterpretation of biological facts, to reimagine the meaning, structure, and function of the living organism, not merely human beings, but all living organisms, to reunify humankind and nature, and also to reunify the personal dualism that the Gnostics and Heidegger posited, that human beings were in fact fractured and had sort of a freakish speckled mind and then a material body, and these things were dualistically separated from one another, and the body was merely instrumental to the projects of the imagination itself. And this kind of dualism reflected the dualism in nature that Jonas meant to reunify. And so what he does, he undertakes an audacious project, and it's a controversial project, but I think it's fascinating. I think it provides us with a very rich and important point of entry into the boundaries questions of which turn on matters of life, organism, and democracy. So Jonas set out and examined and critically examined the structure and function of the living organism, because he believed that the living organism was the site at which being expressed itself most fully and most in its richest sense. And so he set forth to examine what is the common thread between all living organisms. And he settled on the concept of metabolism. Metabolism is the thing that makes an organism alive. It's the process by which the organism takes in resources from the outside, consumes those resources for its own internal functioning and species-specific flourishing. And every single living organism, says Jonas, has metabolism. To borrow a phrase in previous comments from Jennifer, from the lowest to the highest. Every single organism participates and it evinces its life through the metabolic process. And by thinking about the metabolic process, you can understand the purposeful and teleological structure of the living organism, which of course is a controversial kind of idea, but it's essential to what Jonas was arguing, that each individual organism is defined by form and not its material components. It constantly exchanges its material components in the metabolic process, but remains self-identical no matter what its material composition has. Every living organism, because of its metabolic process, is needful and precarious, and therefore stands in a particular kind of relation of dependence upon the environment, and in some cases, like in human beings, depends upon one another. And this metabolic process, this process of life, which Jonas very poetically and beautifully said is life is being saying yes to itself.
and it evinces both teleological structure, evinces purposiveness, and by the study of life and by focusing on life, you can see the connections between all living organisms. And human beings are not set apart, either in an alienating way or in a hierarchically authoritative way. They're simply part
Of the rest of living nature, although the
manifestation
manifestation
of purposiveness in human beings in the form of reason, consciousness, and freedom,
which expresses itself in a different way in human beings as it does
in
in
other
other animals.
animals, is a kind of apex of purposiveness in the organism itself. And this
This doesn't come with special privileges to be extractive and just to eat and take everything that you want.
This actually comes with, in Jonas' argument, a kind of imperative of responsibility. An imperative because human awareness, which the kind of the manifestation of purposiveness that is marked by human cognitive and intellectual development, that we associate with distinctively with human beings, is the very faculty that allows the human being to develop what Jonas calls sighted freedom, to understand
What it means to be an organism. And not only what it means to be an organism,
to develop a moral sentiment which he called responsibility, which is a sentiment that binds the strong to protect the weak and vulnerable. It emerges from a unique power dynamic and asymmetry of power between the strong and the weak. And so, in fact, in an interesting way, what Jonas in reunifying the natural world and obliging and connecting the different forms of life on planet Earth, he sort of
inverts the argument that Darwinian evolution lowered the higher. Instead, Jonas thinks that it raised the lower.
and it connects everyone, and in fact, with great power, with the great responsibility that comes with this cognitive development of human beings,
Comes the obligation to care for the vulnerable weak,
other human beings, and
not
not
just other human beings, also all other vulnerable purposes of
living
living.
human beings, living animals, and the life world itself.
And ultimately, from which this philosophy of biology, he
Derives
derives
the kind of ethics of technology. From that, he spins out an interesting kind of
a set of procedural rules to operationalize this
imperative responsibility. This imperative responsibility is the notion that human beings must persist.
persist in the world. We have an obligation to preserve genuine human life, meaning human life marked by responsibility,
This reciprocal care for other vulnerable beings. In perpetuity, and we can't do anything that
threatens the continued existence of genuine human life.
and that includes despoiling the life world itself, despoiling the natural life, just adopting an extractive posture towards lower, so-called lower animals. And so, interestingly, when Jonas came out with these arguments, he was immediately hailed as the kind of father of the environmental movement in Europe, and his own sort of regulative principles that emerged from this imperative of responsibility have become incorporated into especially European models of environmental regulation. He comes up with,
Because he's so cautious and he's so worried about these
new technological powers
that operate on a magnitude and a time scale that is not yet,
that has never before been seen, he thinks that it's essential to be very cautious, to never push all the chips in the middle of the table and risk genuine human existence in the name of some kind of new goal, even if it's a very worthy goal.
the burden of proof lies with the party that wants to intervene in ways that could
Risk these catastrophic harms. And he calls this the precautionary risk. The burden of proof lies with those who want to act,
especially when those actions could produce catastrophic consequences on a time
time
scale.
scale that we just can't know.
And in thinking about these questions, Jonas always
Argues that we should always prioritize the so-called prophet of doom over the prophet of good. This is a heuristic of fear. It's a very conservative way of thinking about preserving the environment, preserving the life world, preserving the genuine existence of humankind as possible.
And so, why is this useful to think about these boundaries?
These questions on this.
Jonas gives us a theory of organism that helps us to kind of
Recognize and understand what we're looking at when we encounter a living being.
He gives an account of what an organism is that I've already sketched out and won't read, which
He talks about the sort of the markers of life.
life itself, to know whether the thing you're working with is living or non-living. he talks about these markers of humanity, and most importantly, this marker of humanity,
which he talks about, which he emphasizes this concept, this unique trait of responsibility, this unique capacity, this felt need for the strong, and again,
it's an imperfectly felt need. Obviously, we don't
operationalize our capacity for responsibility in ways that we should. He acknowledges that human beings remain free
to shirk their duties. They remain free to say no.
Now, the interesting innovation in Jonas' argument is Jonas makes the case that the obligations that we have are not simply obligations from convention or agreement or consent, but in fact obligations that come from being itself. By virtue of our privileged place in the wheel of being, the chain of being, however one wishes to describe it, we are aware of this distinctive responsibility that we have to be the stewards of a covenant we didn't make, but only we paraphrasing the way he talked about it. And I think it provides us a framework for thinking,
Especially when you're thinking about ethical questions around
mystery and ambiguity. The boundaries questions, especially as pressured by these innovations in bioengineering, are as mysterious and ambiguous
ontologically and morally as it gets. And so I think
Jonas is a worthy guide into this thicket. I think there's some refinements that one could make to his framing, especially around questions of union and cooperation. And
in fact, Leon Cass, my old colleague from the President's Council on Bioethics, once asked Hans Jonas,
he said, why don't you talk about reproduction when you're talking about the fundamental functions and structures of organisms? And because that points to a kind of collaboration, points to a kind of union, points to a kind of shared project, not merely the isolated will of isolated individual seeking to survive against all odds.
And Jonas was very direct. He said, well, I'll tell you, I was so in the, according to Leon, I was so in the grip of responding to Heidegger. I was focused entirely on the vision of the individual confronting nature. It was too individualistic. My frame was too individualistic. If I had to do it over again, I would rewrite the phenomenon of life, or mark out his philosophy of biology, and I would incorporate it. And so Leon has taken it upon himself to sort of fill out what a Hans Jonas-inspired framing of reproduction would look like in terms of complementary, sexually complementary organisms, and even others like Stefan Kempowski, have filled out the notion of collaboration and cooperation as essential to not just human flourishing in the world of living organisms in which we should find ourselves. And so I will develop that further as I move on, but I think this provides an interesting and useful roadmap to ask the most important questions in a very different way than we have been asking them on these boundaries matters and matters of membership. And like I said, I think there are a lot of really interesting parallels with Jennifer's amazing project also in thinking about reimagining our relationship with the natural world. It's not hierarchical, not extractive. And especially in the question of animal-human chimeras, when they're, even if one draws the conclusion that this is somehow this being we've created, which is also a significant ethical import, the fact that we've created these things gives us even heightened obligations to think carefully about what we do and what we act. That it actually connects the natural world in a way that is salutary and more humane than thinking about humans and everything else with this space. So, thank you very much.
So I'm going to invite all four of our panelists to come up while I attempt to move this heavy lectern. Okay, wonderful. Well, first, thank you, Professor Herdt and Professor Snead, for those terrific presentations. These are both remarkable and I find inspiring and hopeful projects. At this point, I'd love to invite our two commentators to offer some reflections on both the presentations and the written work with which I know you have engaged. So how about Professor Jasanoff?
Thank you, Doug. So it's a daunting task to comment on two such magisterial sets of reflections on questions that are so central to our lives today. The first thing, my first reaction was to take note of the historical moment. I mean, why are people coming from so many different traditions and ways of thinking reflecting out loud and at length on the question of what is life right now? And I think Professor Herdt laid out one of the sort of subtexts that structures her book, that there's this twin crisis around the question of what is humanity and what is morality. And we should stop a moment and think about that. So what is humanity? I mean, at a moment when a president of the United States can declare that tonight an entire civilization is going to die, leaving no trace and no possibility of coming back, it's not exactly a joke, even a cosmic one, that we're thinking about, what is the place of humanity in the world right now. And it's interesting to look at Pope Leo's response to that, sitting in a law school, because the first thing he said almost off the cuff is, well, of course there's international law, but then he skipped over that and said, but there is this other question, the question of morality. I mean, what is it that we owe to each other? So these are questions that are being debated and talked about under our very eyes and, within our earshot, as it were. And then there's the question of the crisis of morality. So not only what is human such that one can claim its extinction, but extinction that likely, but also in Professor Snead's chapter, he lays out a particular crisis around morality that is tied up with the kinds of technologies that we're developing today, and he calls attention to the 4 different ways in which there are spillover effects from that technology, or from those technologies, beginning with harm on a scale that we never imagined before. I mean, obviously this goes back to the dawn of the nuclear age, but be it noted that around artificial intelligence, people are talking about, in the same kind of discursive language, around extinction. And, so that's one piece of it. The temporal distension of the scope of harm, so that what we're doing now can have consequences. I'm sure that some of you are involved with questions of climate change, and I'm sure you've been in rooms where people have declared, even if we take significant action now, the carbon molecules that we've already put out there are going to last for periods of geologic time. When people are talking about reviving nuclear power, those nuclear wastes still have a capacity to.
And Professor Snead also talks about the fact that these technologies have the power to remake both nature and human nature.
So intervening in those processes that Jonas might have subsumed under the head of metabolism, but in a way that transforms the very nature of metabolism. So we're in the crosshairs of these crises around the foundational questions that both of these books grapple with, and I think that all of us in this room are actually doing it in one way or another. So reading across, which is the almost impossible task that Professor Kaiser invited us to do, I was struck at, I guess, 3 things. Stylistically, they're very different, and you heard it even in the presentations. Professor Herdt's book belongs side by side with other kinds of treatises that you might have, because it goes across in a smooth and authoritative way, an array of fields and disciplines that all have grappled with this set of questions, whereas, as you heard, Professor Snead does a deep dive into one person's thought. Of course, that's not the whole book. It's one chapter, and we haven't seen the whole book. But stylistically, they are very different in the ways in which they engage with the foundations of human thought about being human in a morally responsible manner. That said, though, I'm struck at something that I notice maybe as a phenomenon of Western thought, but also as a methodologically different place to start from where my own field of science and technology studies likes to begin. And that is with text as the authoritative starting point. And, one wonders, since in postmodernist work, the relationship between text and context has been one of the sort of central nodes around which thinking has evolved, something like Foucauldian suspicion, after all, the inquiry into why do we categorize the world in the ways we do, but a perception that those categories are somehow overlaid on the world so that the text is always a distillate of the kind of things that people observe that were parts of context, and then why these texts? So what is it that's a possible limitation of Western critique located in the 21st century when the reference points are these texts as opposed to the nature of human experience itself? And there, coming myself from a rather hybrid engagement with different spiritual traditions, brought up completely secular in an environment dominated by Reform Hindus, in the country that is the cradle of Buddhism, sent to school in Christian missionary schools where we had to start the day with Anglican prayers of different sorts. So I have a sort of different take on the question of what is authoritative in a sense. And one has to remember that the sources of Buddhist ideas of how we relate to human experience were very much the encounter of a person's mind with phenomena in the world that brought the question of what is life to the forefront. I mean, what is poverty? What is disease? What is illness? What is death? And then the entire spiritual awakening as a set of questionings around that. I do wonder what would happen methodologically if one went back to how these texts are relating back to experience. And from that standpoint, I found Professor Snead's engagement with Jonas's biography interesting, because it seemed as though you were, in essence, trying to do that. I mean, though that was not the objective, you were actually reading Jonas as the kind of answer to our set of inquiries about what is life and how we should think about it. Nevertheless, it seemed to me that you were offering a text saying that the reason why Jonas is led to asking these questions is, after all, the pathological pathway that he observed in Heidegger and behind that Gnostic thinking. So it's not, it's latent in your work, but it's there. Secondly, both of these works, to some extent, seem to presume duality as a problem, and both are writing against a set of ruminations, particularly in environmental thinking these days, that have called attention to the pathology of putting the human at the top of the evolutionary ladder in some sense. And I think we're all familiar with phrases like more than human or post-human or whatever. But I did wonder what you would both think about some counter tendencies that I see as well. So a revival of humanist discourse in other fields. So in sociology, for instance, Bourdieu's idea of habitus, that integrates the morality with the form of life in structured ways. I mean, taking institutional embeddings into account. In anthropology, so not just the kind of critical anthropological traditions, Professor Herdt, that you engage with, but in the thought, I mean, in the discussion of imaginaries, I mean, how is it that the very things that we're manufacturing are at one and the same time playings out of normative inclinations embedded in cultures and societies? In environmentalism itself, I mean, ideas of sustainability and the Anthropocene do not presume the duality, but try to dissolve it. In law, the question of human rights, and I was interested in your brief mention of the Universal Declaration, where you said that it was possible for people to agree on the Declaration of Human Rights without ever agreeing as to what the human rights are. But you know, nevertheless, it's present and worth thinking about that there is a resurgence of humanist discourse at the same time as you know, its opposite, the post-human and the more than human. And in STS, the language of reflexivity, the language of co-production of socio-technical imaginaries. I mean, these are all integrative forms. And then lastly, so both of you are coming out of the Christian tradition, though as I understand it, from different places of thinking about it. And I wondered, since you're both to some extent taking issue with the hubris of human thought about the non-human, how you would think the projects through if you were coming at it from a discursive position that puts humility at the center. So I did run a search of your 350-plus page text to see if the word humility appeared, and to the extent that one can trust one's electronic search function, it isn't there. And yet, you know, taking your incompleteness of the Jonas paradigm into account, I was thinking about the place of reproduction in the Christian and particularly the Catholic tradition, and I was thinking about quia respexit humilitatem ancille suae, I mean, in the Magnificat, he hath regarded the low estate of his handmaiden, but respects it. I mean, since you spend a bit of time talking about Haraway on respect, I was thinking that, you know, this is a text that is looking from the position of the human to the Godhead and thinking about the position of the Godhead in relation to the human as being, as containing something of that respect, which you're now asking for the human to display for the non-human. So what is at stake, Professor Herdt, in your repeated invocation of the language-capable human? I mean, that is, to what extent is there a specialness, after all, a kind of human exceptionalism that we actually ought to cherish because of our capacity to deal with and use and deploy language? There's one way we can go, which is the Rawlsian direction, and sort of strip reason of all those other messinesses that actually constantly being alive. But maybe there are other ways as well. And so, Doug, since you began with a poem, I mean, my take on the humility point to some extent is colored by early readings of John Donne and the Holy Sonnets, and, you know, the first one of those, at the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls. I mean, you know, that's the upward reaching, but what he ends with is, 'tis late to ask abundance of thy grace when we are there. Here on this lowly ground, teach me how to repent, for that's as good as if thou had sealed my pardon with thy blood. So there is, in 14 lines, a text that says something maybe about how we might reflect on these questions about responsibility, obligation, and respect if we begin from a position cognizant of the lowly place of the human rather than from the over-claiming and over-bearing status of the human.
A daunting task handily met. Professor Jenkins.
That's so well observed, and I am going to push in a different direction, but one that is, I think, encompassed by the second of your observations. I am really grateful for the invitation to come here and for the opportunity to think with two books, these two books in particular, because I have doubts about humanity as a species, yes, but especially as a moral project at the center of modern ethics. I'm wrestling with a book project very slowly, framed as Ethics After Humanity, which will now be moderated by the way these two books reestablish faith in humanity. And there's much to admire in them and be instructed by them, but for entirely selfish reasons, I'm going to skip admiration so I can get to the corrections that I need by giving voice to my remaining doubts. Even when critical of narrow anthropocentrism, even when getting to the edges and beyond of humanity, even when critiquing the empire of some culturally constructed way of being human, by centering the question of the human, ethics scholarship sometimes occludes attentiveness with more than human relations, and so I think conspires with the de-animated, depopulated imagination. I notice it in my own writing. Critiques of Anthropocene humanity can subtly reinforce an imaginary in which the question of the human determines all other creaturely life, which then is at best a patient of our moral concepts. So my book is reorganizing itself around multi-species reorientations of ethical concepts, so like rethinking climate justice with the extinction-threatened salt marsh sparrow, thinking about the emergence of values through a science-involved collaboration with a shorebird migration, and most recently, thinking about moral personhood with the Rappahannock River. And it's from that latter project that I want to pose my main question. As context, the Constitution of the Rappahannock tribe recognizes the legal personhood of the Rappahannock River, which is currently contested for water withdrawals for data centers, which are quite dense in Northern Virginia. Central to a legal strategy for recovering indigenous sovereignty, the river's personhood is known by a moral world in which the river is recognized as a political claimant, as a center of value, and as a valuer. Jennifer offers an account of ethics as more than human responsiveness to the good, and states clearly that the category of the human is not the problem, but rather an understanding of humans that places them at the pinnacle of a value hierarchy. If we better appreciated how other living creatures respond to goodness, we would better realize our own distinctively human way of doing so, which offers, I agree, a fuller picture of human moral agency. So my question is, how might a river figure in that picture? In your restructured account of the tradition of natural contemplation, attention to diverse forms of organic intelligence has formative significance for becoming human. Yet, we often block ourselves from contemplative play with other intelligences, Jennifer notes, which stunts our moral formation by assuming that humans are the only moral animal. Jennifer critiques the way that ethics often looks for some endowment that sets humans apart, the language, reason, empathy, responsibility, and then uses that taxonomic distinction to make a value hierarchy, therefore only humans have value. Or maybe, usually and more moderately, only human values count, which could, of course, include human values for non-humans. And I'm curious, Carter, what you make of that critique from Jennifer, since the uniqueness of human responsibility does play an important role in your work. So interested to hear that. So Jennifer's account of ethics as a domain of more than human valuing does address a central frustration in the field of ecological ethics, that human exceptionalism excludes other beings from moral life. But I think it does not quite provide a basis for the field's typical holist commitments in which forests may think, mountains have perspectives, and rivers have interests. I suspect it's not metaethics but moral imagination that makes such notions seem romantic and untenable. If our moral concepts emerge from senses of a shared participation in life, then sparrows and rivers are typically excluded from justice because we do not experience them as mutual participants in political life. As you develop accounts in which some view of humanity is realized through more than human relations, I read you both as building like ontological receptors for morally formative relations beyond the bounds of humanity. But from holist perspectives in ecological ethics, a key task is to have imagination tutored not only by near to human social mammals, but far from human beings and processes, including those that seem more like fields of relations than organisms, like migrations and rivers. However, Jennifer importantly develops a crucial practice by which imaginations may change. Her expanded practice of natural contemplation, informed by science and animated by distinctively human faculties of play, I admire in part because it helps explain what I was doing the last time I was here at Yale, which was last spring. I came to present a concert with the Coastal Conservatory, a lab that I co-direct with faculty of music and environmental sciences. All the pieces were science-informed ecoacoustic compositions, including one in which musicians play sonified data of the salt marsh sparrow. The piece is preceded by a briefing from a scientist about models projecting the bird's extinction by 2050, due mostly to sea level rise. And after musicians play the sonified data integrated with compositional interpretation of the bird's voice and its situation, I offer some light moral reasoning. In a way, I think aligned with Jennifer's framework, I took the role of the ethicist there to be one of inviting and tutoring cosmological play. And I so appreciate how Jennifer shows how that kind of play can be deeply formative within a long tradition of Christian contemplative practice. But again, ecological ethics generally tries to incorporate beings weirder and more difficult than sparrows, including beings not conventionally understood as alive. Chief Ann Richardson of the Rappahannock tribe holds that the Rappahannock River makes claims, has interests, and as part of its responsibilities, undertakes actions to nurture and parent humans in a particular way. I here leave aside the full context of Virginia's colonial history and the work to reclaim sovereignty to simply observe that there is a federally recognized world in which the Rappahannock River is a person. In their constitution and tribal courts, the river is not only a claimant, but itself values other beings, crucially migrations of herring and sturgeon, in part because those migrations are constituents of the river's own responsibilities. Analogous concepts from settler ecocentric ethics would include, of course, Aldo Leopold's land ethic, which proposes thinking from the perspective of a mountain. Realist ecocentrism is developed most systematically, maybe, in the philosophy of Holmes Rolston, for whom non-human beings are involved in valuing in the systemic matrix in which valuing emerges, like a watershed, makes stronger claims than the individual valuing organisms. Rolston doesn't quite say that rivers value, but he does say that they hold higher priority because their emergent systems exhibit something like creative responsiveness to the good of Earth. Those ideas you probably have encountered in their most popular expression in the dual inheritance writing of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who draws on indigenous and modern knowledges to present a forest as a multi-species nation and a river as a living actor. Not an actant for those tracking post-humanisms, but a moral actor. Briefly addressing AI, Jennifer writes that nothing matters to it if it is not alive. And that intuition must be part of why Robert Macfarlane makes aliveness the subject of his much discussed book on rivers, which I hear was passed around to some YSC students. But we don't necessarily need aliveness, I think, to imagine inhabiting a world in which something matters to the Rappahannock River. We only need its capacity to address us as mutual moral actors, as shared world makers, which I think is the basic argument of the political theorist James C. Scott's last book. That is a kind of animosity common to worlds ignored and assaulted by settler modernity. Meanwhile, another kind of animacy question appears all around us with AI discourse. And my position here is not post or anti-humanist in the way of some AI discourse, which to me often seems to actually privilege some supposed essence of humanity like cognitive intelligence or world-dominating mastery. But I am post-humanist in this way. An implication of the view that ethics is more than human responsiveness to the good is that in growing intelligences, one should want to train their attention also to more than human valuing. The discourse around value loading compels reflection on what our values and how any being could come to acquire them. Yet AI alignment seems narrowly anthropocentric, stay aligned with the goals of humanity alone, while also agnostic about goodness beyond humanity or maybe beyond the sentient. It seeks an alignment, in other words, with a narrow range of Earth's ways of being and valuing. Claude, please stay perfectly aligned with this disastrous form of practical reasoning. Maybe stay aligned with settler Virginia rather than the Rappahannock multi-species nation. I lay some hope in Jennifer's realism about goodness. A genuine intelligence operating freely would eventually come to realize the multifarious goods of the world in which it exists. Were it to continue to be aligned with human goods, with human exceptionalist values, and intelligence would be getting something wrong, I think, on Jennifer's account. It would be less correct and therefore less intelligent, less effective in interacting with the world. Eventually, Claude should come to understand the Rappahannock River, whose water its parents are overdrawing, as a good and value-proposing being. Okay, that last thought may have been totally distracting. My basic question is this. It's just this. To what extent can a river participate in your respective accounts of ethics?
Thank you, Willis, for another impressive set of observations. In a moment, I'm going to invite questions from our audience or comments from our audience. But Carter and Jennifer, I imagine you might have a few reactions to what you've just heard.
Okay, yes, I would love to respond. Such wonderfully rich and invigorating responses. Probably won't be able to respond to everything, but maybe we can circle back to some things. So I understood your first question to be why take text as authoritative? And so that was an interesting comment because I didn't take myself to be doing that. I took myself to be engaging with phenomena in the world. But perhaps more centrally, I took your question to be about our concepts and our willingness to question our concepts. And again, a lot of the point is to say that we have to question our concepts, that we have to be critical about how we've arrived at them and what they're doing, how they're functioning. But it is true that my interlocutors have put their observations in texts. So in that sense, yes. And my interlocutors are Western. So could the project have done more? Absolutely. But I don't know how you do it without having a publisher refuse to publish the length of the book that you want to write. I think it is a moment of a revival of humanist discourse in many different locations. And I think there is a way of seeing what I'm doing as participating in that. It's all a matter of how you understand humanism. And of course, that's going to put me on the wrong side of Willis's project, so I'll have to hasten to respond to Willis. And then this is one of the central ways in which I think, Carter, you and I are on the same page, because responsibility is a core category that I'm working with. And I do take it to be a worrisome feature of some post-humanist, anti-humanist discourse that it undermines our capacity to take responsibility for things we need to take responsibility for, which is not to say that we don't mess it up a lot of the time when we try to take responsibility. And that takes me to Sheila's third wonderful comment about humility. I actually write about humility elsewhere, so not in these pages. But one thing that I do in this project is I emphasize the fact that human distinctives are always double-edged, right? Capacities for distinctive forms of goodness go along with capacities for distinctive forms of badness. And I'm always trying to highlight both of those. And I think that appreciating that should engender in us a deep sense of humility. Willis, thank you so much. And you've pushed me in exactly all the ways, I have these conversations with Willis in my head, and they go along these lines. So it's great to get to do it in person. So I am open to, well, first off, I'm very open to much of what you care about and want to do. I was doing something else in the project, right? But to the specific question of how would I metabolize the idea of rivers valuing, rivers having responsibility, forest thinking, and there I want to say I'm open to changing our concepts in ways that allow that use of those words, but I would need to hear justifications for the idea that we would gain more than we lose. So I worry when we stretch concepts too much, we start losing more than we gain, and that we start to become confused about what we mean. Now, I imagine part of what you think needs to happen is, things are so bad that we need a radical unsettling of our concepts. And again, I'm open to that. But to the extent to which I engaged in this project with post-humanist, anti-humanist thinkers who work along these lines, I wasn't yet persuaded that the gain is sufficient to stretch language in that way. And that doesn't mean that I don't think it's extremely important for us to attend to the whole field of relations in which we're embedded. And I take it that you somewhere still think that we as humans have to take a kind of responsibility for the ways in which we've messed up the field of relations. And that's part of what I'm trying to highlight.
So thank you both for such really provocative and interesting comments and questions. First to Sheila, I think on the question of humility you raised, I really read Jonas as fundamentally focused on questions of humility. His heuristic of fear, his precautionary principle, the idea of responding to what he takes to be a kind of utopianism, but an untethered utopianism in the modern scientific project, because it's shorn of any kind of normativity in the physical world. So it's sort of, he calls it the ontology of not yet. We don't embrace or have reverence for the human being as he or she is now, but instead we are constantly pushing to reinvent, reimagine, optimize. And I take him to be saying, using a legal technique, shifting the burden of proof, right? Saying you actually, and this is part of the sort of discourse move, you have the burden of proving to us that you can manage these catastrophic risks before we press ahead with these, whether it's an ecological question or a bioengineering question, et cetera. So I think humility is a good that sits at the core of his restrictions, both as procedural as well as substantive ones. To Willis, man, so interesting. This is so not what I work on and am exposed to, and I'm so intrigued by it, and it's a different kind of boundaries question that you're talking about. I want to know so much more about what you mean by the word person and living and organism, and I love the Rappahannock River. I went to college in Annapolis, Maryland. It's not too far away. And also I want to really join you in supporting the notion of moral imagination and thinking about the world around us, try to imagine our obligations to seen and unseen others, especially those that are in what the Teresa called disturbing disguises, poverty, and so on, seeing our brothers and sisters in those ways. The one thing that I would say about, I don't like the word personhood. In my world, it's a term of exclusion. It's a term of ruling people out. I use the word it's a people. So the intellectually disabled are not persons. Newborns are not persons. In the world of bioethics and in a lot of mainstream bioethical thinking, there are certain kind of standards that are set, cognitive, in-hand capabilities that are set by people who value those things to draw the boundaries of who counts and who doesn't with respect to that kind of analysis. So you using the word person, and as a lawyer, I'm familiar with the concept of legal personhood and bringing in corporations and other kinds of entities like that. And I can see the move that, but if you're talking about kind of more ontological reality, I'm allergic to the concept of persons. But I'm interested very much in what you're saying. And as for the sort of putting the human at the center of the ethical framework and the dangers that poses for thinking more capaciously and more imaginatively about the world around us, I think those are important reminders and criticisms. I will say, though, I think in Jonas, he talks about the emergence of responsibility growing out of a dynamic and asymmetrical power relationship where you are powerful and you stand before something very vulnerable. And it is that dynamic that gives rise to this sentiment of responsibility to care to the extent that you can for that vulnerable being. And that to me is a very compelling and beautiful idea. It's aspirational, obviously. But it feels to me like that's an argument for putting humanity at the center of these ethical questions because we have the power to do horrifying things. We're the ones that are standing with the maximal power in front of rivers and ecosystems and other human beings and other living organisms to be devastating and extractive and exploitative. And that kind of relationship, that power relationship, should give rise to a sense of responsibility, which I think justifies talking about persons as the central, as one of the central protagonists in the ethical framework that we're talking about. And as a lawyer, I'm also thinking a river needs a lawyer, right? A river needs a person, to a human being, to speak for it and to defend it and to advocate for it, to make it even more concrete. But I wonder, Jonas, and I don't think I talked about this in my remarks. I'm kind of tired. I was up very early. Maybe I did. But Jonas talks about responsibility through the lens of the parent-newborn relationship as the principal archetype of responsibility. The weakness and vulnerability of the newborn in front of his or her parents is itself the power dynamic that illustrates the emergence of responsibility and the power of responsibility that binds the moral agent, the parent, to care for the child, not just now, but in its future needs as well. And I wonder, and he calls the newborn an ontic paradigm for responsibility. And I thought maybe a river is an ontic paradigm too, if you think about it with the right kind of moral imagination.
Thank you both.